Let's get our books together. Page 257 to talk a little bit about dialogue. We've got two major sections that we read for this week: dialogue and then plot and story. I'm just going to do them in sections. We're going to do the dialogue one first, and later in the week I'll get you caught up to speed on plot a little bit more. Dialogue's a tricky thing because very often I will have students that will avoid it at all costs. That they will paraphrase things. I'll have very minimal dialogue. Do not be afraid of dialogue. Dialogue is, well, if not necessarily your friend, it's a tool. And it's an important tool that we need to make sure we know how to use. As the book tells us, there are multiple things that dialogue is good for. Dialogue can be good for, one, this is all on 257, can be good for adding to the reader's knowledge of a situation. It's true, right? Knowledge is different than facts. We're going to know things because we're going to know what the characters know. We can't do anything beyond that. It'll keep the piece moving forward. Dialogue can be brisk, it can be engaging, it can be informative, it can really move us ahead on what we're trying to do and accomplish. It can reveal things about the speaker. Sometimes we fixate on dialogue for what it can teach us about a situation, but one of the most important things, maybe in some ways the most important thing, the dialogue can do is that it can tell us more about who a character is. It can also, in the last one here, show us relationships between characters. So the way people interact. Think about your own life. Are there certain people you react or you interact with and react to differently than others? Yeah, I'm going to answer that for you. Yes, there are. The dynamic that certain people have together is different. Dialogue can help us know that. There's certain things that we want to always avoid with dialogue, right? We should not use dialogue to give us information that should be organically handled. On 258, the book begins this. You don't want to use dialogue as a way to give facts. One thing that on great TV shows, they often they do these things, and it happens less because we're in the golden age of TV now, so this doesn't happen as often. But I remember Lost. I used to love Lost, and one thing Lost would do is at the beginning of a given episode, it would just involve two people talking about what happened on the last episode, even if they already knew. Or it'll say things like, well, Kate told me that blah, 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 blah happened. And that is like as inorganic as anything could possibly be. Don't use dialogue as a way to explain things to the reader that an audience member wouldn't actually know on their own. Don't do that. You can use dialogue to keep things fresh. You can use dialogue for the speaker to tell us something, but don't use it as a way to tell us facts about a piece, right? As the book tells us, you've missed your 8:34 train to San Francisco, and if you think I'm going to drive you 34 miles to your job at the law firm of Harris and Sullivan for the 5th time since we were mistakenly married at your parents' summer house in the Hamptons 3 years ago, you're mistaken. Nobody talks like that, right? You want to be careful. You don't want to have dialogue end up being too mimicking of normal conversation because then it could come across as potentially trying too hard. But you don't want it to be that artificial, right? So instead, you missed it again. Oh no, it can't be. Just look at the time. It's a damn clock. I told you not to buy one with the snooze button. Yep, my fault, as always. See how that last line, yes, my fault, as always, gets us into this idea that there is a difficulty in the marriage and relationship without having to be hit in the head with it. It's like making me as the reader feel smart because I am getting into it. Right? Another thing dialogue should never do is describe people, places, or objects in detail. This is not an opportunity for me to explain in dialogue what somebody thinks about somebody else's appearance or what they're wearing. When you see somebody wear something that you like, you typically will say, wow, that looks great. Where'd you get it? Or, hey, boy, that dress looks really cool. That's what people would say. You don't say, you look stunning in your gold lame gown with beads around the collar that shimmers when you walk sexily around the room. Human beings don't talk that way. What they do instead is the scenario that the book presents. Wow, what? That dress, what's it made of? It kind of glows. Wow. See how much better that is? We're creating a scene that is natural and organic, and it's so easy to get caught up in trying to explain too much. But you have to be careful about it. Dialogue should not be used. Absolutely, the book tells us, should not be used in cases where direct narrative would work better. So if we've got situations in which two people are talking and you could just summarize it in a paragraph, then do that. Unless that conversation is doing something to benefit our understanding of who the characters are. But you need to avoid those, hi, I said. Hello, she said. How are you doing? I asked her. Fine, she said. Careful with that. Don't do it. But, when we get to all these rules about what dialogue shouldn't do and what we should be careful about, it gets caught up. We get intimidated. And students, especially young writers, will avoid dialogue. They don't want to deal with it. And that's a mistake. Because as we said, there are things that can really be beneficial. So let's go back to those things it's good for. Now that we know a few things that it's not good for, we can add to the reader's knowledge of the situation. So in a basic natural conversation, there are things that can be said that will be beneficial to us. Do that. Don't overwhelm it. It should never be over the expense of logic, but you can get basic things across. Hey, how'd that test go? Oh, it went all right. What was it about again? Oh, well, it's the anatomy test, and it's been really tough this semester. See, that sounds like a conversation two people could have. And it might be giving me more knowledge of the situation if what it's about is what's going on in that given class. And you can keep the piece moving forward. It's a really good way to create energy. Stories with good dialogue are stories that create energy effectively. Stories with bad dialogue, and bad dialogue would be doing those things we talked about. Dialogue that just feels like it weighs a lot. That's a problem, and you want to be careful about that. Your dialogue should be crisp. You want to avoid it feeling burdened. And if your dialogue starts to feel super burdened, then probably we should do something else, that we can move on, and we can get something else in there. Reveal things about the speaker. And this is a really good way of giving it. What is somebody deciding to say, even if the reader knows a little bit else? The book talks about subtext. We'll talk about that in a minute. But what is it that I'm learning about a character based on what they are prioritizing, right? There are always certain things that people will fixate on, and what they fixate on is going to explain something about them as characters. And so you want to make sure that you understand aspects of this character, and dialogue's a way to do it, and also the way people say it. Think about people that you know in real life, because I assume just because we're writers, it doesn't mean we don't know people in real life. We totally do. We just exploit them for our stories as much as we possibly can. But think about what people in real life we know who have like certain tics. Are there things that they do? Do they use their hands a lot when they talk? Do they like have inflections where they will kind of hit on certain words and then get kind of down on others? Do they have like certain things that they say a lot? These are things that we can use in our stories to help us develop our characters a little bit more. I've unloosed my hands, so they're going to be back. These are all things that we can use in order to create characters and learn about the person and who they are. And we'll talk later about ways that we can make dialogue interesting by presenting physicality in there too. And then we've already talked about relationships between characters. And this is important because a lot of the times we have characters interacting, they are people who have interacted before. Maybe a lot. Maybe they're related. Maybe they're married. My wife and I, when we talk to each other, do not always use our first names in conversation because it is typically pretty obvious who the other person that one of us is talking to is. And in fact, when she does say my name, I would worry. What did I do? What's going on? But often in dialogue, we use the characters referring to each other by their first names constantly. Sometimes it's just endlessly in there. And we need to be careful about that. We don't want to have too many occurrences of people saying their names all the time. We want it to feel as natural as it can in an affected environment. That's fine. So, on 260. This is, it gives us a list of 5 important things to remember about dialogue. To write better dialogue, keep these 5 things in mind, and the book is spot on about these. And the first one is super important. Gesture is part of dialogue. Remember when I was moving my hands around dramatically to make a point about how some people do that, but I obviously never do, because obviously I'm very controlled when I speak, and my hands do not do my talking for me. But people do that, and when we say gesture, there are things that people do. That, maybe you have a character who is fiddling with a pencil while they are talking. Does that tell us anything? They're distracted. They maybe are unfocused on what's happening in the moment. What if they are holding a glass in a way that makes it feel like that is part of them? You can have these things. Make sure that characters are interacting with things. What if somebody's clenching a table as they're talking? And you can't see this, but I am clenching a table right now. Can't you tell? Because I'm making clenchy faces to get that across. But make sure that the way people are moving their hands, the way they're gesturing at each other, the things that they're doing and acting is part of it. Make your dialogue active. And that's something that I've said a few times in our workshops, but it's really true. Your characters don't just talk. Two people don't get in a room and then just stare at each other and talk. They don't do that. They're going to be engaging with the world around them in different ways too. And maybe sometimes people's eyes will be kind of wandering around, their heads will move around. Maybe somebody is not as engaged. Chronicle that. This is good. This helps us understand more about a given situation. You want to make sure you're continuing on with that. I like this next one too. Dialogue is what characters do to one another. So this idea that people, when they're talking to one another in a story, there's almost a sparring type element, that they are engaging with each other. So it isn't just something that actually happens. In some ways, it is almost like a physical exchange, the book says on 261, between characters. And it'll be much more interesting to write it if you think about these other things that are going on kind of on the subtext and underneath. And when we say subtext, it's the stuff that is not said but is implied. And this is something that's really important in stories, is that we read dialogue, we know it means something, but then when we go back to it or we think about it, it's like, oh, okay, they were talking a lot about this, but what they really meant was this thing. And the more we can get that, we can get an understanding of how they're potentially kind of going at each other with this. So dialogue is something that characters do to one another. Silence is part of dialogue. It is, right? Sometimes there are moments in which nothing is said. You can do that. You can acknowledge that. Be realistic about it. If you're having a conversation and someone stops, don't write a line of like, we stopped speaking and just stared at each other for several minutes. Several minutes is a really long time. That probably won't happen. But there could be several moments in which nobody knew what to say, or both characters started to say something, but both realized that there was nothing left to say, and that silence stayed in the air above them for several moments longer than either was comfortable with. Something like that is a good way of getting these points across. So silence is part of dialogue. It happens. Some of us hate it, right? I don't like it. I don't like when I'm talking to somebody and then they stop talking, because I feel the desperate need to fill up that space with words, even if they don't mean anything. And your characters can do that too, or your characters can be comfortable with that silence. You figure out who your characters are. Dialogue is not necessarily grammatically correct. It's true. You can use colloquialisms, you can use grammatical challenging words, you can use things like that. It's fine. You don't necessarily want to do that all the way through. Very few stories effectively are going to get it in the narration, especially if there's a third-person narration. But in dialogue, you can do that. And then there's this idea of making the world part of the dialogue. And what we mean by that is that it doesn't take place in a vacuum. That dialogue is taking place in the world that it's in. And so one exercise sometimes that I like to do, and you can try this, is write a conversation between two characters and then change the setting. Maybe there's a conversation that's taking place in a house alone with two people. Not really a lot to interrupt that, unless they're kids or other people or something like that. But then let's have a conversation between two people. And this time, instead of taking place in a living room at their house, it takes place at a movie theater as the trailers are beginning and a movie is about to start. Does that change anything about the way that dialogue functions? Of course it does, right? It goes from two people speaking at normal volumes to two people doing like this. And what if the conversation is tense and they don't want to be loud? And what if someone says, hey, the movie's on, and then you have to respond to them? That changes things, right? What if two people are having a tense conversation in a zoo and they're walking past the monkey cages. Maybe the monkeys aren't going to interrupt them necessarily, but it's going to affect the way you function, right? It just feels weird. I'm in a different place. So dialogue doesn't take place in a vacuum. When you have these scenes, there are things that are going on in the real world that are going to interrupt them, right? There are times in which maybe hypothetically I'm recording a video for my English 3420 class and someone knocks on my door. And that will be a moment in which I have to change what I'm doing in order to respond to that. There are things that happen. It's fine. You just have to be, as the writer, willing to deal with that. Now, before that section about 5 important things on 260, there's a little bit about attribution. The he said, she said dialogue tags. My recommendation, and the book kind of follows it too, is to keep it as simple as possible. Sometimes I'll have students who will tell me, I hate using dialogue because I hate saying he said, I said, she said over and over again. And my feeling on that is it's totally functional. Just do it. You don't need to overthink this. Like really, really, truly, you do not need to overthink this. All you need to do is go ahead and say he said, she said. Because sometimes when you get into too many words that you're trying to make more interesting, they hold too much weight. The book kind of says that just saying he said almost makes it invisible. It almost is like you don't notice it. And if you start bringing in words like he replied, she shouted, she articulated, it calls a lot of attention to itself. As a reader, when I say he said, she said, when I read those, I don't read them. I see them and I move on. And there's something functional about that. Don't call attention to the things that don't matter in your stories. Call attention to the things that do matter. And are you in this camp? I mean, is dialogue something that you have trouble with? I know a lot of you have talked about how detail was something that's kind of hard to come by. It wasn't something that was easily dealt with. But is this something that you have challenged with? I've always really liked dialogue. I'm somebody who likes to talk and who likes to think about the way people talk. And so dialogue's always been one of the most exciting things about fiction to me. And I'm curious where you fit in this. Is it something that you also feel that level of affection for, or is it not? So let's talk about subtext. And I'm going to talk about Star Wars Attack of the Clones, because no one does. And so I'm going to do it. You know which one this is? Attack of the Clones. It's episode 2. So it's the second of the prequels. And it contains in it, and if there's somebody who truly, truly loves Attack of the Clones, I apologize for what I'm going to say. It contains some of the worst love scenes, romantic scenes that I've ever seen on film. The relationship between Anakin and Padme is painful at times to watch. And if you disagree with me, go back and watch Attack of the Clones, and then we'll come back and talk. And one of the main reasons why it's so difficult is because of the dialogue. And one of the things that's so bad about the dialogue is that there is no subtext whatsoever. It's all text. And so Anakin Skywalker delivers lines that are subtext lines that are just literally delivered. So when you're talking to somebody that you're romantically interested in, likely you are not going to utter the line, "I am forever haunted by the kiss you should have never given me." That's a direct quote from Attack of the Clones. And I really wish that I should have just looked at notes as if, just look down and then look like I was reading notes, so it didn't look like I just memorized that line from Attack of the Clones. But there it is. I am forever haunted by a kiss you should have never given me. Now, can somebody feel that? Maybe. But to say it takes away any intrigue from a line like that. Everything they say is subtext. In fact, I got this from my friend Jeremy that I went and saw that movie in the theater in 2000. Oh, when did that come out? Was it 2001? Jeremy and I were in the theater, midnight showing, at the Spokane Mall, Northtown Mall Theater. Probably you weren't there. Many of you were probably too young to have cared. Probably that was okay. We went to the Spokane Northtown Mall midnight showing, and Jeremy turned to me during those scenes of romantic dialogue and said, "Everything they're saying is subtext." And I thought, gosh, Jeremy's right. And perhaps someday in the far future, some 18 or 19 years from now, I will tell a class this in a video. So I want to give credit to my friend Jeremy for giving me that line. But it's been 18 years. There's probably some sort of a length that has passed that I could just take credit for that now. But I still don't. Subtext, another quote. Buffy the Vampire Slayer. There's a line in which somebody says at one point that the subtext is rapidly becoming text. That's important, right? You want to keep your subtext. The things that are thought about but aren't explicitly said. Somebody doesn't say things as directly as they often do in a story. You know, if you say, wow, that dress is interesting, I know what that means, right? It means that it's bad. Well, your hair looks different today. There's subtext that comes in from that. That's okay. That is much more natural and more interesting than saying your hair looks stupid, which people don't usually say because that's not the rules of society and that's not what we allow. The book also talks a bit about dialect. What's your feelings about dialect? You know what I'm talking about, right? Where you would have cues within the text, within the dialogue of a text, indicating that things are being said in a different way. You for it? You against it? Do you like it? Do you not like it? Let me know underneath because I'd be curious to see what you think. I'm also going to post this on our a separate page because I want to do a prompt and I want to do a dialogue prompt. And I like this one. And so I'm going to post this elsewhere, but I want to at least say it aloud, even if I don't need to because I want to. Here's what I want you to do for your next prompt. Okay, you with me? I want you to write a scene that is mostly a dialogue exchange between two characters. Okay, so I want you to have two characters talking to each other. You can put them wherever you want. They can be talking about whatever you want, but I want two characters to be using dialogue with each other. But that's too easy, so I'm now going to make it harder. The characters are not allowed to use any more than 4 words in any single line of dialogue. Okay, so you have to have 4 words or less. So in this dialogue exchange, very, very few literal words. And I want you to choose your words carefully, but also rely on the other tools that we have while using dialogue. So maybe they're explicitly only saying 2 or 3 or 4 words in a given exchange, but they're doing other things. They are actively moving and they're interacting with the scene. They're doing stuff so that you're using your tools of dialogue to make up for the fact that so few words are actually being spoken. And besides, this will give you an opportunity to build subtext because you can't make this text subtext because you don't have enough words in order to do it. So this is what I want you to do. I want you to write a scene, 2 characters talking to each other in lines of dialogue that never have more than 4 words in a given line. Obviously, in the overall exchange, a given person is going to say more than 4 words in the conversation, but any given line cannot have more than 4 words. Like I said, I'll post this up in a separate thread. I don't want you to post these prompts below, but I like this prompt. This prompt gives us interesting ways to think about dialogue. So below, here's what I want you to do. Talk about dialogue. Talk about the way you view it. Talk about the way that it functions. Talk about how much you like dialogue or if you totally hate it. We also read the story Hills Like White Elephants, which is one my wife hates, another one of those. I like it because I like the way it can help us teach dialogue. So I would love for you to look at Hills Like White Elephants and give me thoughts what you think of the dialogue. This is a story that is almost entirely dialogue. How you feel it's functioning. And what you feel about the story. Did you enjoy reading it? Did you enjoy the format of it with its emphasis on dialogue and the way that it is? So I want you to do that. And again, just post comments below about dialogue, maybe things in this chapter that I didn't get into that you were drawn to, or things that we can elaborate on and discuss in more detail. So as I said, I want to talk about the other thing that we've read for this week, but not in this one. I'm going to give it its own separate video that we'll look at later. But let's keep up with the reading. We're getting into sections that really matter, and with the next one, we'll talk a little bit more about plot. So until then, have a great week.